Hi, my name is Jen, and welcome to my podcast, 40 Days and 40 Nights, Going Off the Grid in Search of God. This is the introduction to my book, which is also being simultaneously posted on my website, godoffthegrid.com. And if you haven't listened to the first two introductions or read them on the website, you may want to take a look at that before jumping in here, or you can jump in here. But you might want to listen to the email post first. So I'm recording this right now in the Mojave Desert, close to Joshua Tree. I wanted to return to the Mojave to read this story in the very desert that it took place. So if you hear things in the background, wind, birds, it's because I'm outdoors in the beautiful Mojave Desert. So this is the introduction, and it is titled The Bee. I'm not sure if anyone just wakes up one morning and decides to head out the door and spend 40 days and nights in the desert. Throughout history, 40 days in the desert is something people have done. There's a long tradition in the Eastern religions, including Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, which has a chalisa, a 40-day solo retreat. In the Abrahamic faith traditions, you have the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, and in the New Testament, you have Jesus. Muhammad's revelations happened during his solo time in the desert. My decision to do this journey cannot really be called a decision. It was more akin to something I could not escape. Instead of 40 days, a more apt title of this book could be called 5 Years and 40 Days, for this journey was reintroduced to my life 5 years ago when I began to listen to an inner voice of soul calling me back to the desert. It could also be called a lifetime so far plus 40 days because somehow I have always known that this moment would come. In May 2011, one particular incident collapsed time, bringing my past, my present, and my future together. I was stung by a bee. It was a beautiful beginning of summer day in Santa Barbara, and my friend Liz and I were walking through an outdoor art fair with her dog Charlie. My life to this point had been a series of different careers, mostly creative, all of which I enjoyed. However, I never had a singular focus. And in the very moment when I was musing out loud to Liz, there are so many things I could do with my life, how do I decide? I was stung on the arm by a bee. It just flew up and stung me. And in that moment, the bee gave up its life, and I began mine. I had an allergic reaction to the bee sting that sent me to the hospital. I was given steroid shots to dampen my immune system and prevent the overreaction from cutting off my air supply. But what neither the doctors nor I knew at the time they administered the steroids was that my body was fighting an unrelated brain infection. It came on so strong and so quickly that I could not figure out how to get myself back to the hospital. I laid in my bed for 3 days, my brain on fire and wide awake but unable to figure out how to dial a phone or stand up. On the 3rd day, my soul left my body. I found myself in a somewhat stereotypical near-death experience. I was standing in a line of people, and we were waiting to go on to what comes next, or to be healed and sent back. Several ancient beings who looked as old as time were laying their hands on people and making the critical decision. The short version of this story, where more will come out later, is that I was healed and sent back. I awoke in my bed and the infection had lifted. I took a cab to the hospital because I was still too disoriented to drive, and a doctor performed a spinal tap and confirmed the presence of the encephalitis. Since I was no longer in danger, they sent me home. A near-death experience changes the tone of the internal conversation that one has with oneself over the question, what should I do with my life? The casual and daydreaming quality is gone. It can no longer be said with the same timbre as, "I wonder what I should get for lunch." The airy and flippant nature of the phrase turns to lead. Or better yet, to the weight of a collapsed star, where all future thoughts and actions and coincidences are now captured and held in an ever-tightening orbit by the gravity of being sent back to resume living. Sent back to do what? My first experiences of prayer took place in the desert behind my childhood home in Tucson, Arizona. So not knowing how to process this near-death experience, I headed to the closest desert for a couple of days. From Los Angeles, where I currently lived, that desert was the Mojave. I needed some time alone. I needed time to ask the question, what do I do with my life? Again, but this time to a different audience. It was the beginning of summer. The Mojave was in full bloom, and it was full of bees. Not what I had been expecting. My first thought was to leave because I did not want to repeat the bee sting incident. But in that moment, sitting with the sounds of the bees, I had a childhood memory return. I remembered that as a young girl in the desert, I had come across a massive beehive. I would sit in the sand below it and watch it for hours. I told some neighborhood kids about the hive, and within a week it had been destroyed by a BB gun. Sitting watching the bees in the Mojave, I remembered being so angry as a little girl could possibly get over the destruction of that hive. My father, a high school special education biology instructor, accompanied me to the site of the destruction. We both lamented the devastation. The swarm had moved on. My father's legally blind with limited vision, and yet he would take my sister and I on nature walks in the evening after dinner and manage to spot things I would have missed even with perfect vision. Teaching nature studies to blind children involves touch, so not only did we look at things on our walks, but we touched them, beetles, spiders, even snakes. At night, my dad would often wake us up if there were javelina outside our yard. We would head out in our pajamas to watch them through the wrought iron fence. The smell was intense. They looked like wild boar, but are actually members of the rodent family. And they were fascinating. Everything was fascinating. Those moments gave me the freedom to explore and play in the desert by myself. I would build forts and find caves to sit in and watch the monsoon rains and follow animal tracks. Most often wearing a sundress and sandals, my hair cut like Dorothy Hamill. As to this day, I've never been a tomboy. And as a little girl in the desert, I began to talk to God. Pretty much in the same way that young kids talk to their parents. Lots and lots and lots of questions. I probably talked God's ear off. And in the way that some children have imaginary friends, I chose God. I talked to God when I was alone, when I was walking to the school bus stop, when I was trying to fall asleep at night, because I was afraid of the dark. In fact, being afraid of the dark, I began to get up in the middle of the night after the rest of the family was asleep and slowly walk around the house in the dark, talking to God to feel safe. I was about 6 years old. You could walk around the interior of our house in a circle, so I would make a couple laps before going back to bed. Sometimes I would look out the window into the desert, especially if the moon was full. And walking fast was too easy. Slow was much scarier. And I would whisper to God the entire time. One nighttime excursion, I was drawn to the television. We had a whopping 6 channels, one of them being PBS. And the programming in process was a documentary about the Holocaust. The programming in process was a graphic documentary about the Holocaust. Up until this moment, the worst act of humanity I had encountered at the age of 6 was the thoughtless destruction of a beehive. But the programming in process was a documentary about the Holocaust. I sat on the shaggy carpet in front of the television, close so I could keep the sound low and not wake anyone up, because I was afraid I would get in trouble for watching TV after bedtime. Alone, I watched the footage of the concentration camps. The starvation, the brutality, the death. Destruction of beehive. Holocaust. It was a large leap for a little girl. The destructive ability of humankind began to sink in. Devastated is not strong enough to describe my state after witnessing this. Horrified is not strong enough. What stayed with me was the pain on the faces of the people subjected to the monstrosities. Something told me that the Holocaust was more than a singular incident, that it was the potential of our species. I knew this because of the beehive. Kids in beehives, grown-ups, and holocausts. I put on my sundress and my sandals and went straight to the desert in the morning. The talk with God changed. Concern had already previously been voiced in regards to the beehive, but the Holocaust was on a different scale. Children often ask the question of parents and pastors, why does God let bad things happen? But I went straight to the source. I was angry and terrified and completely worn out from crying most of the night before. I prayed and I listened, and I got angry and I listened, and I cried and I listened. And I decided that I did not want to live in a world that destroyed beehives and created holocausts. So I made a bargain. I told God I didn't want to live here anymore. And I wanted him to give me the pain of all the people right now as long as I could bear it. I figured I could maybe last 5 minutes. I would be dead, but for 5 minutes, the world could be without pain. And I was completely committed to this decision. I had drawn my line in the sand of that dry desert riverbed. Something began to happen. I felt a warmth grow in my chest region. It was like drinking hot chocolate on a cold day where you can feel it pouring into your body, warming as it makes its way down your throat and into your stomach. Except this warmth emanated through my heart. I felt like God was pouring itself into my heart and through me. And it was warming, but not just physically. It was a spiritual warming that began to consume my body. And everything around me began to dissolve. First the sand I was staring at, then the rocks and the cactus and the sky, my own hands and arms, my sandals, the sundress. Everything began to dissolve in this bright, light source of love. I couldn't move. I'd lost all awareness of my physical self. I was absorbed into something that was God and sparkles. Everything was sparkles. I was 6 years old, so describing a direct experience of God required metaphors of hot chocolate and sparkles. God had answered my tears with an experience of unity. In that unity, I saw that we no longer have to hurt one another because we are one another. Rock, cactus, bee, Jew, Christian, javelina. We only hurt one another and beehives because we've forgotten this. In that moment, it was as if I remembered God, that which is, however you want to phrase it. I ran as fast as I could to tell my mother what had happened, complete with hot chocolate and sparkles. My poor mother had no frame of reference whatsoever for what had just happened to me. At church the following Sunday, I told the pastor. He recognized the essence of what I was trying to describe to him. His face began to turn red. He told me that he had been praying to God for an experience like this for 40 years, and no little girl was going to walk into his church and I don't really remember what else he said. He was just so angry. I just remember wanting to take his hand and take him to the desert so that he could meet God too. But that minister also frightened me. In that moment, an excited little girl who had just potentially had the greatest experience of her lifetime was scared into silence. I knew what I had experienced. I believed it with every cell of my body. The veil of this life had been pulled back for a moment, and I saw a different reality. And I did not dare let anyone take this vision away from me. So I wrapped it up and I tucked it into my heart. And I made a childhood promise to God that someday I would return to the desert, return and pick up where we had left off. But life is complicated. Being in school, working, getting married, I tried to live a life pretending I did not have this childhood experience, that I had not made this promise to return. And then the bee sting. And I was finally brought back to sit and consider my life in a different way. I returned from that couple of days in the Mojave, and aspects of my life changed dramatically. I became an environmental activist. My first act after the bee sting was to get arrested with Bill McKibben at the White House protesting the Keystone Pipeline. I trained with Greenpeace and joined the executive committee of Sierra Club California. I thought that being a voice for the earth was answering my deepest calling and keeping my promise. It turns out I was listening to part of my calling, but there was more. My short visit to the desert after the bee sting was not the return I had promised as a child. The return I promised was something larger, something I still did not quite understand, something that still haunted me. So I went back to school to get a master's degree in ministry and spiritual leadership, thinking that would satisfy the promise I had made. But in my heart, I knew it was not. Claremont School of Theology is a beautiful place to study world religions and spiritual practice, but study is not the same as fully surrendering to a calling. And I was getting closer, but still struggling. What am I supposed to do in this lifetime? If I'm supposed to return to the desert, how and when? Do we get a tap on the shoulder? What if I don't recognize the tap? Or what if I'm too afraid to go? And if I do not go willingly, will a whale come and swallow me up like Jonah? How do we fully realize the lives we're meant to live? How do we listen to the signals of our soul? How do we turn in the direction of our authentic self? The truth is, we rarely get a whale or a bee to transport us to our calling, to swallow up our life as we know it so we can give birth to a new life. Too often our truest calling dies in the details of daily life. Detail by detail, distractions and demands keep us uprooted in an external existence, orbiting outside of our true self, a universe away from the core longing of our inner being. This story is about how the universe, God, whatever you want to name it, conspired to call me back to my highest self, to continue the promise I made with the pure heart of a child.